The 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is chock full of content, ranging from world building advice, advice on how to structure your games, as well as the game's magic items. Another thing it has going for it is that it includes a whole bevy of optional and variant rules that you can include to fine-tune your game. However, not all these rules are created equal. Some of them are convoluted, imbalancing, or just plain strange. But there are some gems in here that we've playtested and have found made our games more enjoyable. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and today we're counting down our top 5 variant and optional rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide, as well as breaking down the positive effects that they've had on our games. Now, before we tumble too far down the rabbit hole, there are a few things I want to get out of the way first. This video is going to be mostly anecdotal. We're not necessarily saying that these are the rules you should be playing for your games. We're just saying that these rules have happened to work in ours. Not every rule is going to work for every table. And we tend to have a very specific style of play that we like, which prioritizes narrative, character development, and meaningful combat, which also means combat isn't happening very regularly. Also, the group that we've been playing with has been playing 5th edition regularly for about 5 years, so we didn't playtest any of these rules with a new player. In fact, if you're a new DM or if you have a new player at your table, my recommendation would be to stick with the rules as written for now, so that way when you implement a variant rule, you can see how it changes the tone of the game from the base system. Last thing before we get to our countdown, I did have an honorary mention, and that would be story-based advancement, which is found on page 261 of the DMG. And I wanted to mention it because it's technically not really a variant rule, but I found that it was one of the key decisions that I made as a dungeon master and the other players that I play with when they DM. This really helped solidify the style of game that we were going for. With this methodology, a DM doesn't award experience points or track milestones for character advancement. Instead, the DM just declares when players get to level up based on where they're at in the story. This structural decision ended up being key in fostering the specific culture that we wanted at the table. In contrast, the first regular weekly game that I was a part of used experience points. And if for whatever reason a player missed out on the session, their character would miss out on the experience. Now, this became a huge bummer when life got in the way, because in a way you ended up feeling doubly punished. Not only did you miss out on the fun of participating in the game, but you also missed out on your character's progression towards the next level and getting more power. And eventually it led to significant power gaps between PCs, which actually made the game less enjoyable for everyone. Instead, by just deciding to keep everybody at the same level, play felt fair, it felt more meaningful, and rather than focusing on tracking and accounting for every experience point, really the players were more invested in how they could contribute to the overarching narrative that we were all, communally telling at the table. There have also been times where I've noticed that a DM is running a dungeon crawl, and basically the question is, what do you do if your players level up in the middle of a dungeon? Do you heal them back up to full? Do you just increase the threshold of their hit point maximum? Instead, when the DM gets to decide when everyone levels up, what they can do is they can position it so the level up is done during downtime. If your group is really interested in, say, role-playing or narratively justifying why your character suddenly has new powers, this is a great system that allows for the space for that. Because if you always level up during downtime, now a player can explain something like, oh, my wizard goes to study at the library and now they've learned all these new spells. That's how they have more power. Or a fighter or barbarian that levels up, maybe they spent their downtime training and unlock a new aspect of their character. So that's why I really recommend it, even though it's technically not a variant rule. Now, on to the part of the video that you actually came here for. Starting off with number 5. Rule number 5 of our favorite variant rules is automatic success on page 239. As a DM, one of the things that would really irritate my storytelling instincts was when something like this would happen. Your wizard carefully studies the intricate rune, which reminds them of a spell-casting technique they learned about in the academy. Please roll an Arcana check. Ugh. I rolled a 2, so it's a 10 for the check. Unfortunately, that's not enough. Hey, can I have my barbarian roll? I got a natural 20. Lucky, right? What does my barbarian know? Now, one solution to this is to crack down on your player's habit of rolling without permission. However, we found that that can also be indirectly harmful to the culture of play at your table. One thing I've learned is that players love contributing to a narrative and they love rolling dice. But like in this case, the inherent randomness of die rolls can indirectly harm the narrative integrity of the story you're all trying to tell. And also, if you as a DM are calling for a lot of unnecessary die rolls, a lot of times your players will fail at things that they've thought they've designed their characters to be successful at, which can make their build choices feel meaningless. I mean, think about it. A wizard that has a +8 to their arcana should probably know more about magical runes than a barbarian that has a -1 intelligence score. So a lot of times, the core gameplay of D&D can shift a little bit, where a DM can instead look at which character is most appropriate for a certain skill challenge, and then maybe give them an automatic success to honor the fact that they've built their character a certain way. And you can always call for a die roll if there's no character with the specialty in mind. What I found is that automatic success is a great way to highlight each character's strength and unique contribution to the party. And it also highlights whether or not a DM has the bad habit of calling for a lot of unnecessary die rolls, or what I would call die bloat. And also, I find that game stories tend to be more impactful when failure is meaningful. So if one character fails on a check, and then another character just runs in and everyone rolls a die until we succeed, now all of a sudden the impact of that first failure is somewhat dampened. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide does warn that using automatic successes can lead to very predictable outcomes. And to that, I disagree. The reason being is even though the binary resolution of success or failure is in a lot of ways predetermined, you never quite know how a player is going to deliver that information. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but have you ever been at a table where your character goes to roll like an intelligence type check, and then the DM starts to narrate all the complex runes that only your character knows, and then they're like, so what do you do next? And then as the player, you're just sitting there like, I just tell the party what you said. It kind of steals the player's ability to roleplay that thing. Whereas say if the DM secretly passes a note to that player, or like sends them a text message with the description, now it's up to the player to choose how they're going to dispense that information. Let's go back to this wizard barbarian example. One player may try to have the wizard dispense that information as a grandfatherly, wise figure, while another might be an arrogant snob that's fresh out of the academy. The party dynamics that are going to arise out of how that information is delivered is going to be unique and unpredictable. So the unpredictability isn't built into whether or not the party succeeds or fails. The unpredictability is how the dynamics are going to form, and then how that's going to have future consequences for the party's social interactions in the future. Number 4 on our countdown of variant rules is going to be action options on page 271, in particular disarm, overrun, and tumble. Now, I know a lot of DMs that would rule these kind of things on the fly, and a lot of times it would be the same ruling or similar to what's presented in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And the reason we include it is pretty simple. It just spices up D&D's gameplay and combat. I mean, D&D already has very limited rules of showing mercy or dealing non-lethal damage to a creature, so having a disarm option now adds to the narrative possibilities and the different character personalities that your players feel comfortable embodying. Like, real quick story example, let's say one of your characters ends up in a duel. Their opponent is known for being ruthless and for always killing their opponent. So maybe there's a powerful story moment there if your character disarms that opponent and now shows what it means to be an honorable warrior. It could also show a lot for a big bad enemy too. Imagine your party tank goes to fight the big bad enemy, and rather than killing them or damaging them or knocking them out, they just destroy their weapon. And then, once the fighter is disarmed, the big bad enemy just wants to talk. That leads to a very different kind of storytelling conflict than just the big bad enemy dealing more damage than you deal them. I also really like Overrun and Tumble because they offer a non-magical way for your character to cross an opponent's space. I find that a lot of times, especially on the DM side, a lot of DMs will add escape mechanisms so that way their big bad enemy doesn't get killed off too quick. But this usually leads to some kind of teleportation like Misty Step or Dimension Door. And I've also been at plenty of tables where everyone's playing an optimized character, and as soon as the big bad enemy tries to Dimension Door out of there, one of them has Counterspell ready to go. So rather, Overrun and Tumble offer for a mundane escape mechanism, and that can lead to more interesting characters. So for example, let's just say that one of the characters is a Juggernaut type, right? Big, bad brute. And as soon as they start to get surrounded, they overrun to reposition, or overrun to escape. Now a DM can feel free to create a variety of different villains, not just spellcasting ones, while also knowing that there's some kind of escape rule built in so that they don't have to depend on these usual tactics. And hey, especially if you're playing a dex-based character, it can be nice to kind of tumble around the battlefield, and it just gives a more diverse action economy. Now, number 3 might be a spicy one, but we found that using facing from page 252 has made combat a lot more tactical and a lot more enjoyable. Now, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, facing is grouped with 2 other variant rules that can be used for grid-based combat using minis. Those other 2 are diagonals and flanking. Now, at one point or another, I've actually played with all 3 of these rules, and I've also taken note on the effect that it's had on the players. The first one that's a little easier to explain and dismiss is diagonals. With this rule, you have to kind of alternate when your character moves on a diagonal, whether or not it costs 5 feet of movement or 10. And this calculation is actually more geometrically accurate, especially over long distances. However, one of the things I noticed with my players that have been playing for like 5+ years is that they would get easily confused whether or not they were doing 5 feet of movement and then 10. It was just one more thing to keep track of. And it didn't really add anything to gameplay. So it wasn't as if they were making more tactical decisions now. And really what it did is it just kind of reinforced that if you had to play a spellcaster with some kind of teleport option to get where you wanted to go efficiently. Now, the reason that I justify not using geometric precision in my games is the fact that D&D's combat is pretty abstract to begin with. I mean, each square is supposed to be 5 feet by 5 feet. And the way that minis end up getting arranged on the board anyway is more conceptual and more like a representation of what might be happening rather than like a strict measurement. In my experience, diagonals didn't lead to more excitement or more strategy. It just led to more frustration and more bookkeeping. So in that case, I value the speed of just having diagonal movement be 5 feet like always, rather than the geometric precision that would be more accurate. On the other hand, the other rule in this little triad is flanking, and that's actually a rule I championed for a long time. One of the reasons was honestly kind of a selfish one. I wanted to play a melee rogue, and I found that I was having a really hard time getting my allies to stay within 5 feet of the target. So oftentimes I wouldn't have sneak attack, which is like my main feature. So the nice thing about flanking is not only would I have an ally within 5 feet of the target, I would have advantage on the roll. And all of a sudden, our party started operating a lot better when we figured out flanking. Now, also, like from a game design perspective, it also made a lot of sense to me. Melee characters, if they were thoughtful about their positioning, would give each other advantage. So they would have a greater reward in terms that they'd be hitting more often, but also because they're in melee range, they'd be in more danger, they'd be targeted quicker. Whereas ranged characters, their positioning was more safe. They could stay back and avoid being targeted, but it'd be a little more difficult for them to get advantage on the rolls they have to hit enemies. Now, while that sounds well and good and simple enough, I did notice some shifts that started happening at the table. First, flanking became the dominant strategy by far. Combat ended up losing some of the tactical elements, and it quickly became, how fast can we flank? We need to flank! Advantage on our attacks, go! And of course, this also broke the upper limit of armor class, so my players ended up like building their parties around flanking and always having advantage, which meant that a lot of like challenging encounters lost a lot of what made them exciting. And actually, one thing that my player noted when they changed from flanking to facing was that when they were playing with flanking, a lot of times they said they felt stuck. Like once they got into position, there was no benefit to moving, because once they did, they would give up flanking for their allied character. And especially if you create an encounter with like one big brute bad guy, they were at like such a disadvantage because they had all the player characters just wrap right around them, all have advantage, and even though they were already at a disadvantage from an action economy standpoint, it's almost kind of like whatever their armor class was reduced by 4 or 5 points because of the advantage. Now, I have seen all sorts of content creators offer solutions or fixes to flanking. Some of them include things like conditional modifiers, like rather than offering advantage, a flanking character gets a +1 or a +2 bonus to their attack rolls. And the reason why I hesitate to do this is 5th edition already isn't very big on conditional modifiers. In fact, the only one that comes up even a little often is cover. And I find that my players kind of get confused once cover comes into play. So instead, I just decided to try facing, and hallelujah. I will admit facing is not for every table. The wall of text that describes it can be a little bit hard to digest, but really what it's doing is it's establishing line of sight for each creature in play. And remember, the players that I'm playing with have been playing the same kind of combat for 5 years, so they have a pretty good grasp of action economy. Adding a simple tracker for which direction each creature is facing was really easy, and it made them a lot more strategic. So basically with facing, what happens is you pick a direction that your creature is facing on the board, and whatever the opposite direction is, like right to their back, attack rolls against that creature have advantage. And the idea is that, they effectively have the blinded condition. They can't see behind them. That also means if you've got a creature with blind sense or tremor sense or something like that, then they're not going to have advantage on attack rolls against them, which now also makes vision and senses much more involved. And like the blind sense fighting style from Tasha's now becomes that much more powerful. So now, rather than just trying to set up flanking, everybody gets advantage, the strategies became a lot more diverse. Like the tank would run around and try to get the attention of the target creature so that the dex-based character can sneak up behind them and get advantage on their roll. But because not everybody is getting advantage and there's only one angle you can get advantage with, now positioning becomes this dynamic, fluid experience that everyone is paying attention to. Now, the other thing is that when you use facing, if a creature can see another creature start to move, like let's say you're trying to get around to a target's back, they can use their reaction to change their facing. A lot of times when I was playtesting facing, I would have encounters with a lot of minions, and what would end up happening is one player would understand they can't get advantage on their turn, but they would force the enemy creature to blow their reaction in order to make sure that they don't get to the back, which would actually set up their allies. And this led to a lot of very cool teamwork moments between the player characters. There is a little bit more to facing, there is a little bit more to keep track of, but I found that unlike diagonals, the extra bookkeeping actually led to more tactical, strategic decision making, and it led to a much more exciting and narratively grounded experience. So my recommendation, give it a try, even if it's for a one-shot. Alright, I'll admit I'm cheating a little bit with this one. In second place for our countdown are cherry-picked features from healing and rest variants found on page 266 and 267. Now, I'm sure that any longtime DM is going to relate to the experience that I've had. You're in the middle of a dungeon crawl. Your players have just had a pretty harrowing encounter. So now they try to hole up and just long rest for 8 hours. And then you have that argument, would it be realistic that you could do that? Is it game balanced? And also, we spend a lot of time long resting. Your players don't even remember the rules to a short rest. So classes that depend on them, like a fighter or a warlock, aren't getting that sweet short rest recharge where they get to use their abilities more often. So that's why we cherry picked a few rules here. First, stealing from Epic Heroism, one thing that we've done is make short rests only 5 minutes. This means that a fighter's Battle Master maneuvers or Warlock spell slots or other features that recharge on a short rest can basically recharge every encounter. Now, we also balance it by borrowing from Healer's Kit dependency from the healing variants. So in order for a character to use their hit dice during a short rest, they have to use a charge from a Healer's Kit. And this accounts for, say, if you get like slashed by a sword in the middle of combat, you're using bandages and supplies in order to treat the wound. Not only does this end up with a unique game balance, it also narratively grounds the mundane healing process of your world. Now, this next part isn't in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but it is a variant rule that I found that works really well in combination with short rests. And it's that long rests have to be 24 hours, but in a designated safe zone. So kind of like our honorary mention, where the DM gets to choose when players level up, the DM is also one that says, all right, now you can long rest. And this just eliminates the argument of whether or not, oh, can we take a long rest before this boss fight? And as a DM, you can also make sure that the long rests narratively make sense. This can also make wilderness exploration a lot more compelling. Reason being is you might be able to sleep for 8 hours so that you don't get points of exhaustion, but the wilderness isn't a safe zone. So if, say, a party has like a 7-day travel from one settlement to another, they don't get a long rest until they hit each settlement. So they have to be much more careful about how they're spending their resources, and it can make the journey feel a lot more harrowing. Now, like a BuzzFeed article, this one may surprise you. Our #1 favorite rule from the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 288 is spell points. Now, really, what spell points are an alternative way to track a spellcaster's magic resources. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide does warn that spell points can be a little bit more complicated, but I find conceptually it actually ends up being a little bit of a wash. A lot of D&D players that come from a video game background understand what a mana pool is. And really, your spell points are almost like hit points, but for your magic casting abilities, where each of your spells costs a certain number of spell points, and you just take that away from the pool. So there is a limit to higher level spells, so you can only cast 1 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th level spell per long rest still. But what spell points helps you do is, say, cast more low level spells in kind of ignoring your higher level spells. Or if you want to cast your higher level spells more often at the cost of some of your lower level spells, then you can do them more times, but you're going to be draining your spell points a lot faster. The metaphor I like to use is spell slots are kind of like an automatic transmission, and spell points are more like a manual transmission. With spell points, there's a lot more conversion to keep track of, but you have more finely tuned control over expending your character's spell casting resources. Whereas spell slots are discrete packages of like the number of casts that you get. And for some players, it's going to be easier to just comprehend spell slots. Now, the reason we love this rule so much is, unlike the other rules we've talked about, where pretty much all your players need to understand them to interact with your game, spell points is a decision that can be made individually by different players. After all, spell points is a straight conversion from your spell slots, which means that theoretically, like 2 players, one with spell slots and one with spell points, have the same total amount of magical resource to spend. It's just that the spell points caster has a little bit more control over how they divide those spell points among the spells they want to use. And eventually, a spell slot player may want to convert to spell points mid-campaign. And all it will do is change the amount of control they have over the spells that they can cast, not like the total amount of power they potentially have access to. So that's our list for our top 5 favorite Dungeon Master's Guide variant and optional rules. Do you agree with our picks? Was there a variant rule you like using that we didn't mention? Let us know in the comments down below. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that little notification bell, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye now.